If your photos look too blurry, too dark, or just not professional enough, it more than likely isn't your camera, it's your settings. So in this video, I'm going to show you the top 10 settings every beginner needs to know. First thing, let's go over the shooting modes. Now, most cameras, on the top dial here, you're going to have various different modes. You're going to have your manual mode, you're going to have your aperture priority, and you're going to have shutter priority. Auto mode is when the camera is going to make all the decisions for you. It's using different metering techniques, and it's going to decide what the shutter speed is going to be, what the ISO is going to be, what the aperture is going to be. This is a setting I highly suggest straying away from because we do not want the camera making all of the choices. Now, most cameras, you do have a programmable mode. I know on like the Nikons, you have U1, 2, and 3. What those are is where you can set up the camera for certain scenes. Like for the Nikon that I'm using right now, I have them programmed for different types of cinematic shooting when I'm shooting video. Now let's start with aperture priority. That is the one that I probably use the most. What aperture priority is the camera is going to make the decision on the ISO and on the shutter speed, where you are going to decide what the aperture is. Now on my Fujis that I use, I have an aperture control ring instead of using the front dial on the camera. But on most cameras, your front dial is going to control your shutter. But all the other dials aren't going to do a whole lot because the camera is deciding what the shutter speed and ISO is. Now, in the menu, you can decide that the shutter speed isn't going to go below a certain point or the ISO won't go above a certain point. Generally, I have mine set to 1/250th of a second, and the ISO will not go any more than 3200 when I am shooting in aperture priority. Now, shutter priority. Same thing as aperture priority, except you are controlling the shutter speed. You again, on most cameras, not on my Fujis when I'm using the Fuji lenses, but on most, you can decide that the aperture has a certain range that it's allowed to go into, and the ISO can only go so high. But you are controlling the shutter speed. Now, full manual mode, that's generally what I'm going to be shooting in. That's where I am controlling the aperture, I'm controlling the shutter, I am controlling the ISO. I have absolute control of everything the camera is doing. Now, on modern mirrorless cameras, I'm able to see the live view through the screen and through the electronic viewfinder. So I'm able to see how the scene looks. Is it too dark? Is it too bright? Then all you need to be remembering is where you need to be having your shutter speeds at and how you want your aperture to control that depth of field. Now, let's move into aperture. What is aperture? What does it do? So aperture, like on this lens here, is going from 1.4 up to 16. So that is an f1.4 to an f16. Now, the way the depth of field works is the lower the number, the shallower the depth of field is that your camera is going to focus in. When you hear words like bokeh, that's having that blurred out background, that is going to be a lower f-stop. 1.4 on this camera is going to give you great bokeh. It's going to give you a very, very shallow depth of field. It's something we typically use when we're doing portraits. Now, when you're doing something like landscape, you want to kick up the aperture a little more. Get it up around an f8 to an f11. Now, something you do need to be aware of with aperture, and it does vary with the lenses, usually your best sharpness is around an f5.6 to an f8. You'll see a lot of guys when they're shooting in studio, like myself, I'm going to be shooting at about a 5.6 to an 8. As you get past 8 on a lot of lenses, it tends to lose some of the sharpness. Now again, this varies lens to lens. A lot of my Fuji lenses, even at a 1.4, stay very sharp corner to corner. Now to most people, they're not really going to notice it, but it is something to be aware of. When you're deciding what you want your aperture to be at to be able to create those depths of field, you need to think of, am I going to end up losing the sharpness as well? Now, you also use your aperture to control the amount of light that comes into it. Think of the iris in your eye. The more light that's on it, the tighter that it closes up. Same goes with aperture. As we move it up to f8, f9, f11, it's going to close the hole up that is inside of the lens and allow less light to come in. Now, that's very important when you're shooting, say, outside on very, very bright days. If you're unable to speed up your shutter enough, then you're gonna need to use your aperture to bring down the exposure and control that light. Now, most of the time, I just bring up my shutter speed and I keep my aperture where I want it. But again, that all depends on what effect I'm trying to do. If maybe I'm using off-camera flash or I'm trying to get some type of shutter drag. It all depends on what it is that I'm trying to do with the photo. Now, shutter speed, what is it? Shutter speed is how fast it's taking the photo, how long it actually exposes the sensor. Now, when we're talking about old film cameras, it's how long it came up and exposed to the film to the light. Now, a faster shutter speed is going to capture things that are moving at a faster speed. Let's use sports, for example. When you're photographing sports, you want to be at 1/1000th of a second or greater to be able to freeze the motion. Now, when you're shooting portraits of people, a lot of times people will say about 1/250th of a second. When I'm shooting weddings, I'm generally around 1/200, 1/250th of a second at the bare minimum. Now, when I'm shooting portraits of, say, seniors and they're just standing still, I might drop it down to about 1/100th. Now, the reason that I don't get much lower than that is not so much the shake and move of the camera, but because everybody kind of has a natural little bit of movement to them. And the lower you get that shutter speed, you're going to start seeing that. And it's actually going to come out and look as if the photo's not all that sharp. Or maybe you didn't get the focus. When really you just have your shutter speed so low that you're seeing the movement of the person. Now, there's a lot of different effects that you can do using shutter speed. Something like shutter drag. When you get your shutter speed down to 1/4 of a second and you kind of twist the camera, move it around, and you create the lines of light that I can show an example of right here. It's one of my favorite techniques to use, and just photos that I absolutely love. I love playing around with shutter drag. It's a fun thing to do and a fun thing to experiment with. Now, your ISO. On my cameras, I've got a dial on the side that has my ISO. Most of them aren't like that. There's gonna be different ones. It's check your camera how your ISO is set. Now, what ISO does is it intensifies the amount of light that the sensor is actually receiving. And it does this by increasing electric currents through the sensor. Now, the trade-off to doing this is it's also going to induce noise into the images. The higher you get your ISO, the more noise there's going to be to it. You're gonna see this a lot more on older DSLR cameras when you get past, say, 3200 ISO. You're gonna see a whole lot of noise. Now, most modern editing software is capable of reducing that noise and really cleaning it up. And modern mirrorless cameras like this here are capable of shooting much higher ISO without really getting the noise. I typically shoot my X-T3s at 6400 with barely any noticeable noise at all. But that's just another part of the so-called exposure triangle. When you have your shutter speed and your aperture to where you want it, but you are still underexposed, that's when you're gonna wanna bring up your ISO to be able to get your exposure correct. Generally, I am trying to stay at my base ISO, which on this camera, the base ISO is 160. The last thing that I'm really gonna change is my ISO. I'm gonna change my shutter and aperture to where I would need it. And then if I need to raise my ISO to get the exposure correctly, I'll bring up the ISO. Now, a lot of people always tell you keep the ISO as low as possible. I say make sure you expose the shot. A little noise is completely fine. An underexposed photo is not. Now, white balance. So what white balance is it's when light hits something, it creates a cast of a shadow. It creates certain tints to it. And the white balance in the camera corrects that. It sets it correctly so that skin tones appear natural, so that the grass colors appear natural. Most of the time, people are shooting in auto ISO when they are doing photo, and that is completely fine. Majority of the time, I'm shooting in auto white balance, but I also shoot into RAW, so it's easier for me to correct it. Now, when shooting video like I am right now, I do set my ISO correctly. Currently right now, I think I'm sitting at a 3200 Kelvin because this light right here is extremely yellow. It's an older tungsten light. But your white balance is the shades, the cast shades. Generally outside in the sun, it's gonna be around 5600 Kelvin. Most cameras have settings inside of it where you've got shooting for daylight, shooting in clouds, shooting at shade, shooting at night, stuff like that. It's something you're gonna wanna play around with a bit and get used to the way that your camera does the white balance. But for photos, for the most part, you can get away shooting auto white balance and it'll look just fine, especially if you're shooting in RAW format. On to focus modes. There's a few different focus modes in the majority of cameras. You're gonna have single focus, which is when you half press the shutter or you back button focus, it's going to focus in on that point and then it's gonna hold it. No matter where you move the camera at, it's focused on that point and it's gonna hold at that focus distance. So if you back up off of it, you're going to lose focus. Then you have continuous autofocus, where when you're on continuous, if you have it on a certain point, no matter where you move your camera at, it's going to hold the focus on that point. And then within the settings, you have different settings to it. Like on this camera here, I have single point, I have zone focus, and I have all, which is just the whole area that it's gonna use. So on single point, you're gonna have a little box that I can move around and I can place it wherever it is that I want to get my focus at. Zone focus is a larger box that I'm able to move around, and anything that is within that box, it's going to be focusing on. Zone focus is something that I generally use during wedding photography. I will be on continuous autofocus using zone focus, and I'll put the box wherever it is I need. As I do have a touch screen, I also have joysticks on the top and the side for my battery grip. Again, autofocus is something that you're gonna wanna play around with. Not all cameras are created equal when it comes to autofocus. Your continuous autofocus can have a tendency to do what's called focus breathing, where it just wants to sit there and kind of keep hunting for the focus. A lot of times that's going to have to do with your settings for the exposure. When you're in too dark of an environment and you're not exposed enough, the camera is unable to find whatever it is that you are focusing on. Autofocus generally relies on what's called phase detection or contrast detection. So it is seeing the different shadows of the face to be able to lock onto it and figure out what it is that you're trying to focus on. So if the scene is too dark or it's way too bright, it's not seeing that contrast and it's not able to lock onto it. Next one we got is called drive mode. Drive mode is what is going to be your single, continuous low, continuous high. On my camera, that is what I have on this. So single is obviously going to be when I click the shutter, it takes one photo. On continuous low, when I click the shutter, this one takes around 15 shots per second. On continuous high, it takes 30 frames per second. That's all that is. It's when you're taking burst modes. But it's called drive mode on a lot of cameras, but that's what it is your burst mode. So when you're shooting, say, sports, and you're shooting at least 1/1000th of a second, and you put it on continuous high and hold down that button, it's gonna shoot out a burst of photos. Now, depending on the type of storage that your camera takes and how fast the cards are, will be dependent on how many photos you can continuously take. Mine, generally, I could shoot for a few seconds before it hits a buffer where it's gonna stop, it's not gonna shoot because it's trying to get all of those photos loaded onto the card. Again, it's gonna be dependent on your camera. Play around with it, get used to it. If continuous burst modes is something that you want to be using, know about where your buffer time is and try to avoid hitting it so that your camera doesn't just stop wanting to shoot because it's trying to buffer all the images to the card. Now, metering mode. Metering mode is, again, different on all cameras. Mine, I have a switch here that controls my metering mode. You have matrix, you have center weighted, you have spot. Those are usually what it is on there. Now, matrix mode, what it's gonna do is it's taking the entire scene. It is looking at the entire scene and it wants to get an averaged meter to it. Center weighted is gonna be generally right here in this area, and it's going to use that area to get the average. Spot is gonna be where it literally just puts a spot on whatever it is, and it's going to meter for that. Everything else behind you could be completely dark, but this part could be exposed. Now with the mirrorless camera, using live view, to me, is probably one of the best ways to actually meter. I don't fully rely on the meter in the camera. I'm going to look through there on the live view, I'm going to look and see how the scene looks. It's all really dependent on how you want it to look. You know, maybe I want it to be a little darker, but when I'm shooting outside and I'm shooting a wedding, if they are backlit, if I shot it the way that the camera wanted to meter it, every person up there would be nothing but shadows. I need to manually expose it to be able to bring them up out of the shadows. Now, it is going to blow out the background in it, but I have the people there. Again, as I keep saying on this, it depends on your taste, the way that you want your photos to look. But you do need to know what each one of those modes do. For the most part, I'm usually just set on matrix metering mode. But again, most of the time I am shooting in manual and I'm relying on my own eyes to look at the images through my camera to set the exposure correctly. Now the last one, exposure compensation. Almost all cameras have exposure compensation, but every camera is done a little differently. Like on my Nikon that I'm shooting on right now, it's got a little button. I spin the dial, I can change out what the exposure compensation is. On my Fujis, I have a dial here. And I know the Sonys also have it just like this. I can move it to +1, I can move it to -1. What that's going to do is, if your camera wants to, say you're shooting on aperture priority, your camera's gonna put it at a perfect exposure. But if you want it a little darker, go -1. It's going to now bring that image down one stop. If you want it exposed a little brighter, go one stop above. That's all exposure compensation does. Where that comes in handy is if I'm shooting aperture priority, again, let's say an outdoor ceremony, they are all backlit. I'm gonna want that exposure compensation brought up because I want the people to be exposed. I'm not so worried about the background. Again, something to play around with and see how it affects your photos. But it's gonna be different in all sorts of situations. As I said, if you've got the subject backlit, then you're going to want to bring that exposure up. Myself, I'm probably just going to switch into manual mode, bring it up myself using the electronic viewfinder. Now, if you're using an older style DSLR, you can turn on the live feed on the screen and be able to see what it's doing. But if you're using your viewfinder, you're only going to see the metering. That's something that you're just going to have to get used to how your camera is in each situation. If you look back on those photos and you see that, hey, when I was shooting it, the normal meter, it was all underexposed. Well, then you're going to want to use that exposure compensation to bring up the exposure that, you know, one stop, two stops, whatever it is that you think you need to bring it up to. Again, something that you're going to have to play around with and get used to for your particular camera. So now you know a lot of the main settings to a camera. So what I want you to do now is take your camera, focus on one setting. Focus on your shutter speed. Go out, go mess around with it. Try some shutter drag stuff. Mess around with the aperture priority. Mess around with the aperture itself and see what kind of depths of field you can get. Now there's a lot more into it when it comes to stuff like depth of field. It's all going to vary on how you place your subject, how far away they are from certain things. There's a lot of different stuff, but now at least you have the basic settings of your camera and can start working on those and see what you can create.